Well, welcome to St. Stephen's University. Welcome to the first thesis reading of 2016. I'm so glad a good crew is here to be a part of this. Been working with Joy on this thesis. Well, it feels like I've been working with Joy on this thesis since the first time I met her at the Barnes place 3 years ago. I think it was the start of the process. And as it unfolded into actually working on a thesis, it's really just been a more and more interesting and more engaging process. It became clear very early on that Joy is a person of rare, intuitive, and practical wisdom. And her parents, Jeff and Marcia, are here, and I blame them for that.
So do I.
I know that she's gained a lot of that from you. I'm so glad you could be here. And it's an awesome thing and a very energizing thing to work with someone on a project like this when they have those kind of gifts. Intuition isn't always helpful when you're writing a thesis because sometimes you leap far ahead and forget that amazing truths are not self-evident to everyone else. But that's all part of the game, all part of the process. There was one point along the way where I particularly gained respect for Joy as part of the formal thesis process, and that was a point where we were talking about, as you probably already know, she's talking about experiencing the death of God. And we had a conversation early on where it was like, so why wasn't, a different model of church, something like the emerging church, or even, for example, something like the St. Croix Vineyard. Why wasn't that an answer to the problem that would just make all this, go away? And Joy's response to that was really increased my respect, because you could, just the fact that I have some level of association, for example, with that church did not phase her response at all. And it was, well, it's not. It's just such a temptation for any church to start describing God in a way that serves their agenda and that promotes and is a part of the control of what's going on, and a new God just becomes an idol very, very quickly. And I could tell that emotionally she wanted the other to be true, and so that's where the respect came in, because she wasn't going to take the easy answer because it was emotionally attractive, but was wanting the truth and wanting what really worked in reality, and so I was very impressed at that point, and the thoughtfulness behind why that wasn't a quick solution. So of course that was just one of many moments that increased my respect for Joy along the way. But now we're here, and we made it. She made it, and she has produced a really outstanding thesis, and I'm very, very grateful that you're all here to be a part of this and hear her to share a summary of that with you. So Joy, if you could come up, I'd just love to say a prayer for you. And what I'd like to do, I'm going to actually read prayer attributed to St. Brendan. And so St. Brendan's story, setting off from Ireland, and a coracle, familiar story in SSU circles, it felt very relevant to your thesis. And so I thought of changing the pronouns in the prayer to be focused on Joy, since I'm praying for her. But then I thought, no, I'm going to leave the pronouns inclusive, because it's a voyage that we'll all be taking as we listen, and join with Joy in the moment this morning. So I'll begin with that, and then I'll just add a short prayer on the end after that. Help us to journey beyond the familiar and into the unknown. Give us the faith to leave old ways and break fresh ground with you. Christ of the mysteries, we trust you to be stronger than each storm within us. We will trust in the darkness and know that our times even now are in your hand. Tune our spirit to the music of heaven and somehow make our obedience count for you. Lord, today, this morning, fill this room with your peace. Fill Joy with your peace. And we just await her words. Thanks. Amen.
The death of my God started when I was about 5 years old. At the tender age of 5, I started to pray every night for Satan, like you do. And I prayed for Satan's soul that he would accept God's love and that he would begin to love other people too. My parents thought, surely that can't harm a child. And so they would listen to as I prayed for Satan every night. I think even as a child, I had an innate belief that the Christian story either had to work for everyone and everything or nothing at all. Since then, I've realized that the problem might actually be God. Maybe. My thesis my story is entrenched throughout my thesis, and so at first I wanted to keep my experience out of it to keep it academic, but Walter has been teaching me that that's a part of academic and especially a part of SSU. And so I'd like to share my story with you as a part of this presentation. When I was a child and hearing Bible stories and filtering it all through my concept of God being good and God being love, I remember the first time that I asked a question, which I think is actually when I began to deconstruct. And it was when I was hearing the story of Noah's Ark. And I was sitting in Sunday school, and I can remember my teacher had a felt board, and there was all kinds of felt characters and felt animals, and you all know what felt boards are, right? Yeah. If you don't, I'm too old to be a student. And my Sunday school teacher was teaching the story of Noah's Ark, which I had probably heard before. But it was the first time I noticed the people that weren't on the felt board, but were in the story. And it's the first time I remember raising my hand and asking, how is this a good story? And what happened to all of the people that drowned? What happened to all of the animals that drowned? And they were telling me this story as if it was really great news. And I remember being really confused as a child. The one thing that I do remember, I don't really remember her answer, but the one thing I do remember thinking is that questions weren't okay. She became uncomfortable at that moment. Probably because she didn't really know the answer either. But I remember thinking it wasn't okay to ask questions. Noah lived, God is good, people died, don't ask questions. Throughout my teen years, I took what I was being taught really seriously. Luckily, not everyone does, but I took it very seriously. And I grew up in the whole phases of what would Jesus do, and true love waits, and I kissed dating goodbye, and all those really helpful things. I'm trying not to be sarcastic. I remember in the what would Jesus do phase, I remember coming home, and it's funny because it's often phrased as a question, but in my life it was never a question. We always knew what Jesus would do. Jesus would not smoke, and Jesus would not drink, and Jesus would not have sex, ever. And I remember being very certain of these things and wanting to live it out in my life too. And I remember coming home one day and my dad telling me that Jesus would have smoked. And that he probably wouldn't want to hang out with me. I may have been a little judgmental at the time. And I also remember crying and disagreeing with my dad. The funny part was I wasn't upset that he said Jesus wouldn't want to hang out with me. I was upset because he was challenging my beliefs. And I also had an innate realization that if I asked even one question, that everything would fall apart, and I couldn't go there. In order to avoid hell, I didn't ask questions. I remember hearing over and over that God died so that I could live. But the truth was that I was dying so that God could live. I felt a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety, a lot of confusion, and I tried to push those things down so that the God that I was worshiping could continue to be God. At the end of high school, it was the first time that I faced a lot of tragedy in my life. There were several car accidents on Grand Banana, and one by one I started watching my friends die. The last one of these that died was a close friend of mine named Alex, and Lincoln's named after him, Lincoln Alex. I remember standing outside of the church that I grew up in, and I remember knowing that his body was on the other side of the wall, and that I was going to have to go into my church and see him. And as I was about to go in, several people came up to me and said things like, "It's God's will. You have to trust him." Or God needed him more than we did. And I remember thinking, I just lost my friend. Do you want me to hate God too? After Alex's death, I started to have a lot of nightmares. One in particular happened over and over. And I would go to sleep, and in my dream, I would be taken from wherever I was, and I would be told that somebody else died. And they would take me to the morgue or wherever, and there would be a body laying there with a sheet over top of it, and they would bring the sheet back and ask me to identify the next person that died. And I couldn't see the face. And in my dream, they would scream at me over and over until I picked someone to die. And I would wake up screaming. And I started to realize that I couldn't do it. But I was worshiping a God that could. We had a lot of youth rallies when I was a teenager, and Alex would come to some of these with me, but I couldn't for the life of me remember if he went up front and gave his heart to Jesus. And at those moments, that was the only thing that mattered to me, was that he was in heaven. And so I would watch the videotapes we had of these youth rallies, and I would watch them to the end. And at the end, they would fade out after the altar calls, and I would just pause it at every second to try and see if he went forward. A couple years after this, and I decided that the best thing to do was to become passionate about evangelism and make sure that nobody ever went to hell. And I've already told a couple of those stories, and I think for my own sanity, I'm not telling them today. I may have acted a little strange to make sure people knew Jesus. It was really helpful. But a couple years after Alex died, I was still really struggling with whether he was in heaven or not. And other people seemed to be able to come to the conclusion that God was still good. And for me, I felt like hell couldn't really be a side story. That if this story I was being told is true, I didn't know how to make it not the point. Especially when people I love could be there. A couple years after he died, I had another dream. And in my dream, I was in the church that I grew up in, and Alex walked in, and he sat beside me, and I freaked out and gave him a hug and said, "What are you doing here? You can't be here." And he said, "I don't really know what you're talking about." and said, let's get out of here, let's go. And we hung out for the whole day in my dream. We played basketball, we went to the beach, things we would have done. And at the end of my dream, we ended up back at the church, and he gave me a hug and he held my hands and he said, I'm alive, I'm good, I'm safe. And I woke up. And I think that's the first time I consciously let my own experience affect my theology. I think that we do it a lot, but it's the first time that I consciously said, regardless of what I'm being taught, regardless of what the scriptures say, I feel peace that Alex is okay. And because I let my experience enter into my theology, it trickled into other places too. It's when I began to really doubt, to question. As I was doubting and questioning, I thought the best place to go to figure these things out was Bible school. Not being sarcastic. At Bible school, I often felt like the problem was me. The answer to my questions, the answers to my doubt, the problem couldn't be God, and so it had to be me. And I struggled a lot with that. I wanted the problem to not be me, but I started to internalize it, thinking it must be me, and wrestling with a lot of that. It was towards the end of Bible school that my questions must have been coming out a little bit more than I thought, because people started secretly giving me books that were written by heretics that they thought maybe would help me. And so I started to read people that I hadn't read before, one being Brian McLaren, that I know has been to SSU before, and he was a big part of helping me become okay with my questions. At Bible school, I did meet Mary Brent, so we're glad that I went. After this, I began to really vocalize my questions and say them out loud, and that's when I started experiencing rejection and not fitting in the Christian culture. So I became a pastor. If you're not unsure of why I kept making these decisions, I'm really not either. So it's okay. And I actually really I was a children's pastor and really loved being a children's pastor. And I'm slowly remembering all the really great things about it, along with some other things. But it was while being a pastor and really trying to create spaces where questions and doubt were valued, where mystery was valued, where people that didn't fit in were valued. And the more I became passionate about that, the more that there seemed to be a distance between me and the church that I was at. I became quite involved in the emergent church and met a lot of the leaders within there. And I'm just going to read a paragraph because I feel like it was a really big moment for me to realize that switching denominations, switching thought processes, which I thought were giving me freedom, were actually adding to a lot of my bondage, I guess. I became more involved in the emergent church as I felt they valued questioning the system. I met a lot of emergent leaders and was excited to find a place that I could belong. But the more I became involved, the more I began to recognize the same struggle of power and control. It just looked different. It seemed as though the emergent church found it liberating to ask questions and then found their own new set of answers. And those answers were treated with the same power dynamics as the systems they were originally questioning. They became certain that their questions in view of God were the correct view. It seemed as though the emergent church was trying to find a way to make the oppressive system work instead of denying the system and the God it served. Eventually, I came to the conclusion that questioning the religious systems of right belief which created a hierarchy of power and control, was not enough. It wasn't enough to question the systems of certainty. I had to question the God of certainty. It was when I saw that these systems of oppression were a direct result of worshiping God that God finally had to die. I wish that I could say I left the church protesting and more of like a renegade hero, but I feel more like the church destroyed me. I ended up losing my job, my home, my identity. And all I had to do was grieve. And a lot of people can say that a lot of my concepts of God needed to change. But that was the only God I had, and it was the only God I knew. And so to lose him was to lose myself. But I finally admitted that the problem wasn't me. The problem was God. Okay, let's move on to something different. Dave Tomlinson says, Christian orthodoxy, then, should not be understood as some fixed body of doctrine or moral teaching, or as a rigid pattern of ritual and liturgy, but as a conversation between past and present, between scripture and reason, between tradition and experience. Along with that, Gordon Kaufman says, the idea of God with which any particular individual works is always a qualification and development of notions inherited from earlier worshipers and prophets, poets, and thinkers. I think what I didn't know was that the God of today is not the God of the past and of the future. That the overarching concept of God I was not aware of. I was only aware of the God that I was being taught and that I believed in this moment. Realizing that these concepts have come from other people, which came from other people, which came from other people, was actually really liberating for me. And realizing that it's all good. It's good that God is morphing into things. It's good that our ideas of God are changing. It's when we stand still that the God of certainty can become oppressive. Having said that, not all thoughts and constructs of God are good and helpful. There are two different examples that I used to show the differences between our Christian cultures that show how different God can be described from people that all call themselves Christians. The first one is from Desmond Tutu, who earned universal respect for his role in facilitating at least some level of reconciliation in South Africa. And he says, we are sisters and brothers of one another, whether we like it or not, and each of us is a precious individual. It does not depend on how things such as ethnicity, gender, political, social, economic, or educational status, which are all extrinsic. Each person is not just to be respected, but is to be revered as one created in God's image. To treat one such as they are less is not just evil, which it is. It is not just painful, as it frequently tends to be for the one on the receiving end of whatever discrimination or injustice is involved. No, it is verifiably blasphemous, for it spits in the face of God. On the other end of the spectrum, within the Christian culture,
what was that again?
In last December,
Siri wants to know.
I get it, me too. Last December, at Liberty University, which is the largest university in the world. So it's not necessarily just a little small pocket of people that think this way. But Jerry Falwell Jr., the New York Times reports him in his speech saying, "I've always thought if more good people had concealed carry permits, then we could end those Muslims before they walked in and killed us." He said to more applause, "Let's teach them a lesson if they ever show up here." Two very different ways to view God, both within the Christian church. And I think that the differences, the extreme differences, have allowed people to deconstruct the religious systems as of lately. We are deconstructing oppression and how the church is treating the other. I'm not sure that we're going far enough by just deconstructing the systems. Tomlinson says, if you don't have doubts, you actually don't have faith. You have certainty, which is quite a different thing. And I think that much of the Christian culture, especially the evangelical culture, has created certainty rather than faith. Within the Christian faith today, it seems as if there is no recognition of the disconnect between our thoughts about God and who God really is. Peter Rowland says, "Speaking of God is never speaking of God, but only ever speaking of our understanding of God. The moment we declare exactly who God is precisely the moment we are no longer speaking of God. Much of the Christian church is not worshiping God as they claim, they are worshiping their thoughts about God." Rowland says it this way, "The primary problem with idolatry is not that it falsely claims to have a connection with God, but rather it falsely claims to understand the God it is connected to." Much of my experience was of worshiping a God of certainty, where we knew exactly what was right, exactly what was wrong, what you had to believe to be in, and what you couldn't believe in. How's that word? We knew what we had to believe. It sounded good in my head. Meister Eckhart famously prayed, "I pray God to rid me of God." And I think that's what it looks like to ask God to rid us of the gods that we are constantly creating within ourselves that feed our own egos and our own agendas. Perhaps our spiritual journeys should lead us away from certainty, but into mystery. Apophatic theology is really helpful in this. It embraces the mystery of God and values unknowing over knowing. Once again, it must be reiterated that because of the contemporary value placed on certainty and right belief, the resulting creation of God as an idol, it is perhaps the greatest act of worship today to allow God to die. In other words, if God is an idol and is perpetuating hatred rather than love, it would be better for God to die than to be believed in. I'm going to try and get away from my thesis because I think that this was a really important thing for me to realize. I think in my own journey, I kept wanting to switch the teaching. I kept getting uncomfortable with one line of thinking, but I still needed to be certain of what was true. And so I would switch to another line of thinking within the Christian culture and within the Christian church. And I felt free for about 5 minutes. And then I started to realize that there was the same oppression in that system, and so I would switch slightly to another more freeing thought, or what seemed more freeing. And the longer I stayed in the Christian system, I started to realize that it was actually the fact that I was claiming certainty and claiming exactly who God was that made God oppressive. The death of God has been woven through history. The most famous, perhaps, is Nietzsche, who said God is dead. Nietzsche's words were, Gods too decompose. God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. And I wonder if Nietzsche, instead of speaking against Christianity, was speaking to the heart of Christianity. That our job is to kill the gods that we create, to allow God to resurrect. Having said that, losing God is not easy. Denying God is not easy. I've been on this journey for a long time, and when I wrote my first chapter for this thesis, I didn't even use the word death. It's scary to let go. It's scary when your whole identity is wrapped up in that God is certain and true. Richard Rohr talks about this process of allowing God to die, and he says, some native people call liminal space crazy time. It's a time where nothing looks like it used to, like the time after the death of someone you love. I believe that that is uniquely the work of religion, to lead someone into the crazy time. Religion should lead us into this space and deconstruct the old normal world. Much of my criticism of religion comes about when I see it not only affirming the system of normalcy, but teaching folks how to live there comfortably. Cheap religion teaches us how to live successfully in a sick system. I remember, I was going to ask you something before I started. I'm just going to tell it. Do it.
I need to drink water.
Me too. Walter and Walter, I went to Walter for therapist, as a therapist, so yeah, I went to Walter before coming to SSU, and he walked through a lot of this with me. But I remember one day in his office, and I was talking about being with some friends and feeling so trapped because the language that they were using, which is the only language I ever knew my whole life, was making me feel like I couldn't breathe. And I remember talking to him about sitting at a bar, so obviously I've moved quite along in my journey thus far. Sitting at a bar talking to them, and the more they talked, the more anxious I got, and I thought, something is wrong with me. I can't even hear this language right now. It's making me feel crazy. And the more I talked, I remember Walter looked at me and he said, have you ever heard of narrative therapy? And he started to tell me that there's this thing out there that was what I was describing, and which was really helpful because nothing seemed like that I would fit in anything at this point. And so I started reading about narrative therapy before I came here. And I found that the more I've looked into it, the more I feel like narrative therapy actually can really help somebody dealing with the death of God. And so that is where I took my thesis. Narrative therapy is the first post-structural form of therapy, and it is very skeptical of meta-narratives and the idea of universal truth. So anybody deconstructing their faith, this form of therapy is going to match up with a lot of the process that they're already in. Perry and Robert say this about biblical stories. The answers they give did not have to be literally true. They had to only satisfy people's curiosity by providing an answer, less for the mind than for the soul. For the soul, they were true, but probably no one bothered to ask whether the truth was factual or merely metaphorical. That question came later. The idea of truth is something that I think that we have created in order to make the God of certainty work. And I think when we created the God of certainty, the idea of truth changed from a focus on meaning to a focus on facts. So maybe there is hope for Noah's Ark yet. White and Epson are the creators of narrative therapy, and they got a lot of their thinking from philosopher Michael Foucault, which we did study in one class, and I probably won't get into him too much because I'm just beginning to understand him. But one thing that Michael Foucault talks about is the panopticon. And who else was in that class? Ian. And the panopticon was, let's get the right page so I'll make sure I get that right. Michael Foucault talks about the panopticon as the 18th century prison system. And it was designed in a circle, and the prisoners were all in their individual cells. And in the middle of this circular prison system was this place where the guards would be. But they created it in a way where the guards could see the prisoners, but the prisoners couldn't see the guards. So it took many less people to keep the prisoners in line and safe, because it was the thought of the guards being there that kept their behavior in a certain way, not actually the guards themselves. And Michael Foucault talks about this in relation to many things in our lives, many systems. And I actually think this normalizing gaze, this expectation that you have that people are watching you and what they expect of you, is a huge part of our religious structures today. I knew how I was supposed to act, how I was supposed to think, and how I was supposed to talk. And that came not necessarily from people being around me all the time, but this normalizing gaze that God is always there and these are always his expectations of me. Narrative therapy has a few techniques that help when breaking out of a system like that. The first thing that is looked for is unique outcomes. So things that say maybe the dominant story that you're believing, maybe that's not the only story in your life. For me, I think one of those unique outcomes was the dream I had that Alex was safe. It was something different than my normal dominant story that says there is a truth, and I chose to believe that regardless of what my dominant story was telling me. And there were many other moments like that I could look back and say, there's part of me that wants to live out a different story than the dominant one I was being told. The next technique of narrative therapy that I think is really helpful is externalizing the problem. The biggest motto of narrative therapy is the person isn't the problem's the problem. My whole life, I was the problem. To externalize that and create a distance between me and the problem gave me liberty to look at the problem and find out what I was going to do with my life in comparison to the problem. For narrative therapy, in order to do that, there's lots of questions that are asked to figure out what the problem is and then put distance between you and the problem so you can start to look at the problem differently. One of the things that you need to do is name your problem. Give it a name so that the name isn't you. And for me, once I externalized the problem, I realized that it already did have a name, that its name was God. Once I could do that, it freed me up. That the problem maybe wasn't me. And maybe the problem was God. The next part of narrative therapy is called thickening. And And what that does is it takes these smaller stories that seem insignificant and it makes them really important in your life. But it's really hard to do that by yourself, especially when you're surrounded by language and conversation that only perpetuates the dominant story in your life. So to find people and community that can help you live out these other stories in your life are really important. And for me, coming here helped thicken my story. It gave me people, it gave me language, and it gave me a different identity. To experience the death of God of certainty can trigger a loss of one's own meaning. However, through deconstructing the meta-narrative of God in one's own life and finding alternative plots that are already a part of one's life, a person can be freed to find meaning and purpose through the death of God. A bunch of people say this. Monk, Winston, Crockett, and Epstein say the simple idea from which the narrative approach developed is that people make meaning. Meaning is not made for us. This simple statement contains a wealth of implications. For one thing, it puts people in the driving seats of their life. They produce the meaning for their lives. Thus, we do not lose meaning by denying the meaning given to us by one story of God. In fact, it could be in denial of that God that we find meaning. I was really blessed to get to interview two of the people that I really wanted to at the beginning of this. One was Kathy Escobar, who wrote the book Faith Shift and is in the States creating community for people who believe and don't believe alike to be in community together. And the other lady pastor is Greta Vespar, who has come out as an atheist pastor. And she is a part of the United Church. And I got to hear both of their stories. I'm not going to get into the interviews too much right now, but I did want to just comment on some of the things that I ended up really realizing that made a difference for me. One is that I think that labels and terms can be misleading. And so I think that whether you're an atheist or a theist, you can believe in certainty. And whether you're an atheist or a theist, you can believe in mystery and goodness and wonder. And sometimes I think people who call themselves atheists and people who call themselves theists are actually talking about the same thing in either direction. I think that it can be dogma and oppression, both within theism and atheism, to be so secure in certainty of who God is or isn't, and people who don't think like this don't fit in. But I also think that within atheism or theism, you can believe in goodness for all people and mystery and wonder, but it's how we hold our beliefs that really makes a difference for ourselves and the people around us. End to end. I saved the acknowledgments for last because I don't know if I'm going to get through them. Walter, thank you. Your presence in my life has made a big difference. I feel so blessed to have had you as my supervisor. Thank you for believing me and pushing me and reining me in. You helped me write a piece of work that I'm really proud of, and I'll forever be grateful for that. To Rachel, who couldn't be here today, thank you for the many hours that you poured over my words and made this much better than it was. To my family, Brett and the boys, you guys are my whole world. Thank you for doing life with me and encouraging me to be all I could be. To my parents and brothers, thank you for believing that I could go back to school. And Dad, if it wasn't for the past 3 decades of conversations, these words wouldn't exist on this page. To my lifelong friends, who never stopped believing me and texting me and encouraging me along this way, even when it meant that I had no time for you. Thank you. And to my SSU community, I didn't plan on you, but I love you dearly, and I love being a part of who you are. Thank you for giving me one of the greatest gifts of my life. And I could say every day, because you've all been a part of this with me, but I did just want to mention Ian. Thanks for being my thesis buddy this year.
To participate for a while, and one of the things that we talked about a lot was that the kind of ideas that Joy was exploring and expressing could be communicated in ways that leave people comfortable, or they could be communicated in ways that leave people uncomfortable. I think she did a good job of mixing those two together. So if you were too comfortable, I don't think you heard her accurately. So I really like that balance. But please, anyone have some questions they would like to ask?
So, Joy, there are many thoughts going through our mind, but just to be very specific. So you talked about atheism or theism as both being, I think you said that they both could be based on certainty. So but certainty seems to be a problem as well. So do you think you can live and you can be okay living in the absence of any kind of certainty?
Yeah, I don't know. There is something within me that still wants certainty from time to time. And then I feel good about having it for a bit. And then I see how my certainty affects people around me and how I have to view the world and how I have to view people who think differently than me. I think that there is a possibility for certainty to be a good thing. I don't think that it happens very often.
Is it something that, so you would say that you are probably striving in that direction?
For certainty or for?
Yeah, for certainty.
Right now I'm trying not to.
Yeah.
Because I think that because it's so much a part of what I grew up with and who I am, I think that I could have grabbed onto anything and believed it with my whole heart because I needed something.
Yeah.
And so my goal right now is to be okay in the unknowing and in the mystery.
So I have this image in my mind of balloons floating by and sort of grabbing onto a balloon and it floating you, but then grabbing onto another balloon and that floating you. All of those being, each of the balloons being some form of certainty.
Mm-hmm.
So, but if you're not holding a balloon, a balloon at any point in time. I mean, I totally get the wanting not to even need the certainty, not to be holding on to something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so I don't know, I guess there's no question.
Who knows what's underneath me that I'm going to fall into? I don't know. I get the struggle.
Of God.
Peter.
Thank you. I love this journey that you've so beautifully expressed for us.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I do hear certainty in a lot of what you're saying. I heard a lot of words about goodness being better than badness, justice being true and worth fighting for. it seems to me that there's some things that you expressed a great deal of certainty about.
Yeah, I've noticed that too. I think that there are some aspects that I feel certain about. My hesitancy with that is that I've been certain before that my kind of love was good, my kind of God was good.
Okay.
And I do think that I do still have certainty about love and justice being better. My fear is that I'll develop a kind of love and a kind of justice that serves my purposes again.
Okay.
Dad!
First of all, I'm really glad I could be here today, and I'm proud of you. Journeying with you has been a real joy. All of my life, all of your life. As I listen today, I see myself as your dad and the conversations we've had over the years and my part in that. My question is not one that I expect to have answered today,
Okay.
but one that I would ask in order for you to continue to wrestle with. And that is, how does this journey, this thesis, how will it affect your parenting?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What do you pass on to them that may be, that's my
Yeah.
question.
The only thoughts that I have right now, it terrifies me. The only thing that I do recognize is that my kids have a lot of goodness and wonder and beauty already in them. And maybe I can be a part of bringing that out and affirming that, but I'm really terrified that I'll mess them up worse than you guys messed me up.
I have a question.
Yeah, Sarah.
Great job, Joy. I could listen to you talk for hours. I hope I can in the future. I just am wondering about, again, this is maybe of all the questions, another one that you won't necessarily have an answer for, and that's okay, but the idea of having hope for the church. Do you, in giving the example of how moving from the evangelical world, which I understand that perspective as well, and then looking at the emergent church and then finding frustration that every church system you entered into seemed to take its own version and actually maintain some of that oppression and not actually go beyond that and tear down that system. And I think we're all guilty of doing that in a lot of ways and at risk of doing that. But do you have, in finishing this, and even just after those interviews, which you didn't get very far into, but do you have hope for the church and the church, not so specifically any denomination or any faction of the church, but in terms of being able to, as a whole, as small communities, as small groups, or as large communities, that we could go through this process of breaking down those idols and actually coming through the other side? Not that we know what the other side looks like, but yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
What comes to my mind though is actually when I was able to travel to Calgary last year for a course for Lois. I was a part of one of about 16 students from all over the world, many different languages, and we got to experience 2 weeks of travel and pretty amazing things together. And one of the speakers that came and spoke to us was a Muslim lady. And as she was sharing, I saw a lot of my own story, and her fears were matching a lot of mine, and she was afraid to allow her kids to go to mosque. She was afraid to allow her kids to get immersed in her religion for fear that hatred would be something that was taught underneath some of that. And as I got to dialogue with her, we both had this really beautiful moment of recognizing that a lot of the same problems are not just from one religion, but that underneath all of this there might be something really good and beautiful that we can affirm in each other. So I have hope that religion can be good for the world and can do a lot of good. I don't know. I don't know about beyond that. Yeah.
Thanks.
I have a question for you. Just to preface this, it seems to me that like this discussing of like getting rid of certainty is really just acknowledging the fact that we all have different ways of looking at God, and just acknowledging that certainty was never a thing. Like this idea that there was like a unified understanding of what God is. So the question I have is like you mentioned the atheist pastor, and like a lot of people are going to be very frustrated because this is deconstructing identity as Christians in general, and where does that go? What is Christianity at the end of the day? What can we all call ourselves as this thing?
Yeah.
And the thing that I'm wondering is whether the name Christian itself is under fire. Like this is something that we have to discuss as like inner outness. Is God not just understanding wholeness as compared to brokenness? Like you see where that discussion is starting to go? Like it seems like we're just trying to understand what Christian means. You know. So do you think that that's perhaps where this will end?
I think that should be a part of the discussion, and I think it's really good. Maybe it's really important to recognize that not all Christians have the same experience that I do, and that some people are finding a lot of hope and joy and language that really works for them, and I actually think that that is good. Like, I don't necessarily think that they're finding oppression within Christianity. I think they're finding freedom and goodness. And so I think it's possible that our experiences and languages may differ, but I think it's what is underneath the language that needs to be recognized as well. And so I just guess that I do agree that I would like Christianity to come under attack a little bit, but I think that there is a lot of good people and goodness within it, just as much as I think there is goodness and good people outside of it. I don't know if that answered.
It's a big question.
Joy, something I noticed in your title and throughout, and when you were naming your problem and things like that, was that you were talking about the death of God and not the death of your idea of God.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could expand on that.
Yeah.
Why you chose to say that and not talk about your idea of God.
I've really struggled with that actually, and struggling with the language of the death of God, period. And then it's just my ideas of God, which is, there's a lot of truth in that. The only thing that I want to push on that is that for a lot of us, our ideas are God. And so to challenge those ideas is to challenge the only God that we know and are worshiping. So I guess that's the decision I made, was that I really wanted to push back on that, because it's easy for me to say, your God's oppressive and mine's not. Or that idea of God is really unhelpful, but my idea of God is good. And I think that we constantly need to be recognizing our creation of God and our part in that. Yeah. But I think it's valid. Hannah?
You can answer either one of these questions. I guess I'd want to ask you, what was your favorite thing you read for your thesis, or what one book or author should we read if we want to be thinking more about this? Or you can think about that again.
Okay.
It's a big.
Yeah. Yeah, I will think about it. I mean, the first name that probably comes to my mind is Peter Rollins. I think that he's really helpful. Not everyone will like him, but I find a lot of this stuff really helpful in this.
You had used the term, I think I heard it right, apathetic religion, and then.
Apathetic theology?
Yeah.
Apophatic.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay, so. That's what I was wondering, because you talked about.
I don't
the
care.
mystery.
Sorry.
Yes, okay.
Apophatic, right? Yeah.
Okay,
Sorry.
that's okay, no longer have a question.
Agnes?
Well, I do have other questions.
Thank you so much. One thing that really jumped out at me is how careful you are about language, and I really appreciate that. And I think you did a wonderful job showing how words and language can just corner someone and trap people in very real ways. You think, oh, it's just words, but it's not just words. There's so much power in language. So thank you. I'm interested, and I really like the distinction you made between faith and certainty. And I'm just wondering if you could just, what other words or things do you associate with faith that you don't associate with certainty?
That's a really good question. One for me that's becoming really powerful is mystery. And finding mystery exciting and joyful and not scary and awkward. Another thing though that comes to my mind is this story that was really formative for me years ago, of this man who was in his younger years a part of World War II, and he was what's it called when you don't fight?
Conscientious objector.
Yep, he was that, and so they put him in a mental institute to be like a guard in one of those places, and for the purpose of, let's see if you don't use violence, if you really believe it, let's see if you don't use it. And a group of them were a part of that, and they took a lot of abuse, but they also changed the way that mental illness was dealt with then. But I remember him telling this whole beautiful, amazing story, and then at the very end of the story, he says, but could be wrong. And he had given his life to something, literally, and then still was able to say, could be wrong. And that to me is beautiful.
It's more like a dance than someone, a guard. He wasn't guarding anything. He was involved in something bigger. I was really struck by that dream you had of Alex coming and spending the day with you, as being a very mysterious part of, do I dare say, God speaking?
Yeah. Thanks.
I really loved how you included atheism on the spectrum of certainty, and I think that the issue with certainty is how we push it on to others and use it to judge people, and I've seen that in atheism as well. So I just really appreciated that you included that.
Thanks.
Okay. Well, I just want to offer one thought too, and that, one of the sets of language that didn't come up, I think, a lot today, which is somewhat present in your thesis, is the language of crucifixion. And God dying. I remember the moment in my own studies of narrative therapy where I really dove into Michel Foucault a little bit, and I thought, you know what, his critique is pretty strong, and there's a lot that's hard to refute, but the only understanding of God that could survive what he was saying is a God on the cross. And a Christianity lived out with incredible humility. And that's what I see really well reflected in your answers. So, yeah, beautiful. So, thank you.
Thank you.